Clinton New York field office may have even contributed to Director Comey's decision to send the now infamous October 28 letter, a letter that could not have come at a worse time, likely impacted the election. Now, last year, I asked Director Comey specifically about leaks to Mr. Giuliani. He acknowledged for the first time that internal investigation was ongoing. Director Wray, was Mr. Comey telling the truth in that? He said here that there was an internal investigation ongoing about the leaks to Mr. Giuliani. Was he correct?
Senator, I can't speak to what Director Comey was or wasn't
I'm just
saying.
asking, but was he correct that there is an internal investigation ongoing on the leaks to Mr. Giuliani?
Senator, for reasons that I'm sure you can appreciate, I can't confirm or deny the existence of an ongoing investigation, whether there is one or isn't one.
Okay.
One of the main lessons of this
The only reason I raise it is there was an open hearing. Former Director Comey said there was such an internal investigation.
Well, there are a number of things that I probably would have done differently.
Mr. Horwitz, you want to take a stab at that? Or
I'm certainly not going to comment on whether or not there is an open or ongoing investigation, one way or the other. We have, over the years, refused to do that, and I'm not going to change the policy now.
Well, Mr. Horwitz, you and I have known each other a long time. I assume that's the answer you give, but here we know about Mr. Strzok's private life, and we know about his text messages, but we know nothing about the leaks from FBI personnel who are actively taking steps to sway the election to Mr. Trump. You did not include an investigation of those leaks in your report. Is that correct?
That's correct for the reasons we noted, that we're not able to speak to work we might have ongoing.
Well, I would hope that the investigation is ongoing. At some point, you report to us, because it was generally accepted around here that leaks were going to Mr. Kaufman, were going to Mr. Giuliani during the campaign. In fact, Mr. Giuliani basically said so on TV. Now, the president says that this report totally exonerates him and says there's no collusion with the Russians. Now, Inspector General Horwitz, did your report even consider the question of collusion?
Our report was focused on the FBI and department's handling of the Clinton email investigation. It touched on the Russia investigation, as we lay out here, when we found the text messages in that July-August time period, and then the decision that was made in October about whether to proceed or not proceed with the Wiener laptop. That was the sum total of our.
But there's nothing in the report that says it exonerates the president from any question of collusion with the Russians. It says nothing one way or the other. Is that correct?
We did not look into collusion questions.
So I just note the president says it totally exonerates him, even though there's no conclusion one way or the other about the question of collusion with the Russians. Now, Director Wray, after learning that the FBI utilized a confidential source during the early stage of the Russia investigation, the president described that as a scandal bigger than Watergate. I'm one of the few people here, the only person in the Senate that remembers directly knowledge of Watergate. I tend to disagree with him. And I'd say the confidential sources are a routine investigative tool. I've got I have a document that is publicly available in the FBI's online FOIA library. It's a redacted interview summary from the Clinton investigation. It shows that the FBI used a confidential human source in September 2015, well into Secretary Clinton's campaign for president. So, Director, does a possible use of confidential sources in either the Clinton or Russia investigation by itself show any wrongdoing by the FBI?
Senator, as you alluded to, we use confidential informants in all manner of investigations covering kind of the waterfront, and it's a very, very, very important tool in that mission.
Any of us who've been prosecutors know you probably don't have a significant prosecution without some confidential sources. Now, Director Wray, the President said on Friday the Mueller investigation has been totally discredited by the Inspector General report. I asked you last month when you were before the Appropriations Committee about the Russia investigation. You confirmed at that time you do not believe it is a witch hunt. Now, the special counsel investigation has already resulted in the indictment of 20 individuals, 3 Russia companies. Do you have any reason to believe that this investigation has been discredited?
Senator, as I said to you last month, and as I said before, I do not believe Special Counsel Mueller is on a witch hunt.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. And you were very direct in both occasions. Now, the mistakes made by Director Comey during the Hillary Clinton investigation didn't exist in a vacuum. Republicans in Congress relentlessly pressured the FBI to release details concerning the Clinton investigation. I'm deeply concerned that we're repeating these mistakes today. The White House, working with allies in Congress, have been aggressively demanding information from the Russia investigation. And Director Wray and the Deputy Attorney General pushed back. They've been threatened with impeachment. That's outrageous. Obviously, something will never happen. But some accommodations have been made. And members of Congress, eager to politicize any details, have reviewed a FISA application and learned the identity of a confidential source. Are you confident that kind of precedent will not damage the FBI in the future?
Senator, I think we have 2 competing interests that we have to balance. We have an obligation to be responsive to congressional oversight. That's important. I think that's part of our job. But we also have an obligation to protect sources and methods, to protect ongoing criminal investigations, to respect things like grand jury secrecy. And it's a challenge at times to do both, but I'm confident that we can do both as long as both sides are willing to work together on it, and I'm committed to trying to do both.
Senator Thank you very much.
Senator Cornyn.
General Horwitz, I believe your report summarizes, as regards to former Director Comey, that he concealed from the Attorney General his intention to make a unilateral declaration or declination of intent to pursue charges against Secretary Clinton. He made inappropriate comments on uncharged conduct. He erred when he said that he usurped really the role of the Attorney General in the Department of Justice when he said that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges under the facts, and that he violated a number of Department of Justice policies and norms. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I think your opinion was certainly reinforced by op-ed pieces by former Attorney General Holder when he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, and by Jamie Gorelick and Larry Thompson, former Deputy Assistant Attorney Generals, in an article they wrote, "James Comey is damaging our democracy." The Rosenstein memo that was written by the Deputy Attorney General, forwarded to the Attorney General, and then attached, I think, to a letter whereby the President informed Mr. Comey that his services as Director of the FBI were being terminated, substantially similar to what you found in your report, correct?
I haven't gone back recently and read the letter. I think it's a straightforward comparison that could be made about it. I'll leave it at that.
Well, the way I read it, it looks to me like you validated what Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein said in his memorandum. Would you dispute that, or you agree with that?
I wouldn't dispute it, but I haven't gone back recently and reread it.
I think what's so disturbing about this era in the FBI leadership is it just seemed to be a culture of impunity, where the rules did not apply to the director and his leadership team, but obviously were designed to apply to everybody else. And by the way, I agree with Director Wray when he talks about rank and file FBI professionals. We're not talking about them. We're talking about a group that somehow went terribly awry in the leadership team of Director Comey. General Horowitz, you mentioned that you found no evidence of bias in the investigation, but you qualify that in talking about documentary and testimonial evidence. Right. Are you discounting the text messages from Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page, for example?
No, what we were trying to do was be clear that we were focused on the very specific investigative decisions we looked at, and what was significant about and I'm now talking about the pre-July 5 announcement decisions, was that Strzok, Page, and others were not the sole decision makers there. They were team decisions, and in many cases, prosecutors' decisions, as opposed to the individuals who wrote the emails. We made very clear we were not saying that as to every single decision. As you know from doing these kind of cases, there are hundreds of decisions being made, and in fact, we did not find no bias with regard to the October events.
Well, Director Comey was pretty clear that he expected Hillary Clinton to be the next president of the United States, correct?
He described that with regard to, yes, the October events, the Wiener laptop.
And sometime in the spring of 2016, he already decided that there would be no recommendation to prosecute Hillary Clinton, correct?
Yes, he started drafting his statement on May 2nd.
And it wasn't until July 5th when he made his initial press conference where he said that the evidence did not rise to the point where any reasonable prosecutor basically would prosecute Ms. Clinton, correct?
That's correct.
Do you think it's possible, or let me just ask you, is it a fair inference to draw that Director Comey, expecting Ms. Clinton to win the presidency, was thinking about his future as the FBI director?
I think that was a concern we had, certainly where it's even clearer in that October time period, because we have testimony that indicated that when he explained through his chief of staff why he was going to do what he did on October 28, he was concerned about his survivability.
And when, for example, he used the word grossly negligent, which are the words of the statute, in describing Ms. Clinton's conduct, later on it was changed to extremely careless.
Correct.
Do you feel like he was writing toward a preordained result, or that this was a genuine process to think through what the evidence was and to try to apply the applicable law?
I think that would be hard to say and probably be speculation in terms of what he was thinking at the time. We try and lay out in great detail various places, including that, how it changed and how it evolved and why. But I'm not sure I can sit here and say precisely what was his thinking on the time.
Were you shocked to learn that Director Comey had his own private Gmail account at a time he was investigating a potential prosecution of Ms. Clinton for recklessly using a private email server?
I have to say it surprised us that he would have been sending emails, although they were unclassified, but nevertheless using a personal Gmail account.
Director Wray, Director Comey has talked about higher loyalty to his own sense of justice and his belief that that was required in order to protect the reputation of the FBI rather than to follow established policies and guidelines and the law. I believe that hubris that Director Comey was demonstrating and suggesting that the rules did not apply to him that applied to everybody else has brought this firestorm down on the FBI. Do you think it's appropriate for any director of the FBI to attribute their actions to a higher loyalty to some other cause other than the rule of law and the policies and guidelines of the Department of Justice?
Well, Senator, I don't want to speak to what Director Comey may or may not have been thinking, but what I can tell you is that my own view is that the rules, the policies, the guidelines, the long-established norms, as the Inspector General's report refers to them, those things are there for a reason, and it's important that we track those. And that's why when I'm going around from field office to field office, doing town halls with over 30 offices, the point I keep making everywhere is that it's not enough to say that you're going to do the right thing for the right reason. That pretty quickly can become the ends justify the means. What we need to be doing is doing the right thing in the right way. So not let the ends justify the means, but let our means justify our ends.
Well, General Horowitz, I believe that your report, as comprehensive as it was, and I commend you on the great care that you've undertaken. I don't necessarily agree with every word of it, especially the no finding of no bias. But I think your findings call into question the credibility of the whole Clinton email investigation and cast a cloud over the Russia investigation, because the same group of people that led the Clinton email investigation were leading the Russian investigation until at least such time as Director Mueller, the special counsel, terminated their services because of the appearance of conflict of interest. Do you share those concerns?
I share the concerns, and we wrote, in fact, here that it did cast a cloud over the entire Clinton email investigation.
And the Russian investigation?
Well, we haven't reached a conclusion on that, but we laid out here the concern that when the choice was made in October, whether to work on in terms of Mr. Strzok in particular, the Russian investigation versus the Wiener laptop matter, the choice was to make that a higher priority, the Russia matter, over the Clinton matter, and we were not convinced that that was not a biased decision.
Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your testimony. The communication which you go into detail describing between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page includes some damning statements, and you make that very clear in your conclusion about their possibly using their governmental authority to achieve a political result. Is that correct?
That's correct. I felt that was very serious error.
And that should not be downplayed by anyone. It was serious.
That should not be downplayed by anybody. I can't think of something more concerning than a law enforcement officer suggesting that they're going to try and use or may use their powers to affect an election.
What did Special Counsel Mueller do when he learned about these statements by Mr. Strzok?
We informed him on July 27 of last year of our first findings of these texts. We subsequently gained more, but my understanding is within a week or two of that date, he had been removed from the investigation.
Which was the right thing to do. And I want to make it clear based on previous questioning here. No one is making excuses for these things. Mr. Strzok said something that was inappropriate, unacceptable for a person in his position. Mr. Mueller responded professionally and terminated him as soon as he learned that. I hope that's on the record and clear. You spent a lot of time, and I want to echo the comments made earlier in this work, reviewing all these documents, text, and interviewing all these witnesses. And I know you, and I've heard your testimony, and there's no doubt that you know this Inspector General's report in detail. Lots of people reacted to it. Politicians, individuals, news commentators, and others. I'm going to ask you, for the record, specifically your thoughts on one reaction. Last Friday, President Trump said, and I quote, "I think that the report yesterday, maybe more importantly than anything, it totally exonerates me. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction. And if you read the report, you'll see that," the president said. He went on to say, "I did nothing wrong. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction. The IG report yesterday went a long way to show that." End of quote. General Horowitz, does your report totally exonerate President Trump?
I'm going to stick, Senator, to what our report does speak to, which is the handling of the Clinton email investigation, and to the extent it touches on the Russia investigation, it does it as we lay out here when the Wiener laptop comes up in October, and I can't speak beyond that to how this report might impact the Russia investigation or what individuals think how it may impact the Russia investigation.
I ask you to clarify that. You can't speak to whether your report exonerates because it does or it doesn't? What are you saying?
We did not investigate, as we laid out here, when we saw those text messages, many of which are in that July-August time period. We've made it quite clear here that this review does not touch on the Russia investigation, with the exception of what occurred in October with the Wiener laptop.
And does it say anything as to the issues of collusion and obstruction in that Russian investigation?
We don't go into any issues related to the Russia investigation beyond what I mentioned.
Last Friday, when he was talking about the IG report, President Donald Trump said the special counsel investigation led by Robert Mueller, quote, has been totally discredited. Mr. Horwitz, does your report show any reason to doubt Robert Mueller's integrity or discredit any decisions he has made?
I'm not going to make, Senator, a judgment on Special Counsel Mueller's investigation. I'm going to speak to what I have here.
I want to stay within the four corners of your report.
And
Do
I'm
you
not-
address the credibility of the investigation of Robert Mueller?
We did not address the credibility of the special counsel's investigation here. We laid out what occurred, and we laid out what individuals did in October where it touches the Russia investigation.
Last Thursday, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said in an interview with the Washington Examiner he wanted the Mueller investigation to conclude. He said, quote, if the IG is through, why can't the Mueller investigation finally wrap up? Was there any connection in substance or duration between what you were tasked in doing and what Robert Mueller is tasked in doing?
Again, other than the issues we talked about where we identified text messages and brought them to his attention, we do not have any connections, interactions in that regard.
Director Wray, my colleague, Senator Leahy, and others have raised the question about the New York field office and leaks in that field office. And there are quotes in the report relative to Mr. Comey's concern that New York field office would leak information. And that's one of the reasons why he made certain decisions. As Senator Leahy said, former Mayor Giuliani has bragged publicly about information that he's received from that office. What are we to make of this? Is this being investigated? Is this just a problem that is acknowledged and accepted?
Senator, I think leaks are unacceptable. I think they have a pernicious effect on our ability to conduct investigations, to protect sources and methods, to retain our foreign liaison partner relationships. They damage the privacy of individuals under investigation. I could go on and on. So I have a very strong view about it, and we're doing a number of things to try to make sure we
That's
crack
what I
down
want to get
on
to.
it. Right.
What are we doing about it?
Well, I can't comment on any specific investigation, but we have, as I think I mentioned earlier, we have a dedicated unit specifically focused on leak investigations. That's new. We have a policy that we issued in November that makes the rules crystal clear so that there can't be any ambiguity for any of our employees in any office about what their obligations are. And when there are misconduct found, we will refer them to our OPR for appropriate action. And if we find one that's criminal, we will pursue it criminally.
Director Wray, I just have a minute and a half left, and I'd like to ask one last question, please. There was a question raised earlier about Mr. Comey having a separate personal phone that he was using, and whether or not that was an unusual thing for a person in his position. There's been reportedly the president uses 2 White House issued iPhones. One allows him to make calls. The second is for his Twitter habit. According to Politico, the president has, quote, resisted his aides and treaties to swap out the Twitter phone on a monthly basis because it's too inconvenient. Supposedly, the president has given Kim Jong-un his direct phone number. If he was referring to his cell phone, this would raise some interesting security concerns. Are you aware of these reports about various phones that are being used by the president? Are you concerned about whether or not sensitive information from those devices may be intercepted by our adversaries?
Senator, I'm not aware of the particulars of the president's phone usage.
Would it be a matter of concern if anyone who has access to such information was using a device that could be intercepted by our enemies?
I think it's important for all of us to recognize that device security is a particularly important part of our security. and it's something that we emphasize heavily in the intelligence community.
And of course, we've gone to great lengths when it comes to Hillary Clinton to make that point. Thank you very much.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to both of you for being here. I want to point out one clarifying matter at the outset. The report did, in fact, find bias. So insofar as anyone is suggesting that there was no bias found here, that's just not true. There was, in fact, bias found. What was not found was any smoking gun indicating that that bias translated to and was admitted to have translated to how anybody did their job. But the absence of evidence on that point is not the same as evidence of absence. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as we have this discussion. Mr. Wray, I'd like to start with you on this point. Let's assume for a minute that these text messages between Strzok and Page, let's assume that these came about earlier in the discussion and that you just swap out the name Trump for Hillary, as such that the text messages said, well, she's not ever going to become president, is she? No, we'll stop it. What if that had been the exchange occurring earlier in the Midway investigation? In that circumstance, in that hypothetical, could she, as a practical matter, have been prosecuted, assuming that the facts warranted it, assuming that people making the charging decision concluded that there was good cause to charge her? Or would the bias displayed in that exchange make it too difficult to proceed?
Well, Senator, I'm reluctant to engage in discussions of hypotheticals.
It's what we do. We're lawyers. We talk about hypotheticals, right?
But I'm no longer practicing as a lawyer. Now I get to blame the lawyers. It's a wonderful experience. So I'm not going to try to engage in specific hypotheticals. What I would tell you is that I expect all of our employees to engage in professional conduct, including in how they communicate with each other by text message.
I get that, and that didn't happen here. So if let's make it more of a hypothetical then. Let's take it a step back. Could that be a complicating factor if you had text messages between agents involved in a case indicating bias against the target of that investigation? Can that be a complicating factor in deciding whether to bring charges?
I think any time that agents conduct themselves in a way that doesn't have not just objectivity, but the appearance of objectivity, that can have an impact on the viability of the case.
Thank you. Mr. Horowitz, let's talk about these text messages for a minute. Was it easy for you to get them?
No, it was, well, the initial batch was easy. They were with the FBI, and we requested them. The latter part of this over the last 6 months or so was challenging.
Challenging. When you say challenging, tell me what you mean by that.
So when they were produced by the FBI, it turned out that there was a period during which, about 4 to 6 months, I don't remember the exact time, where there were no text messages produced to us. It turned out there was a flaw in their collection software, or a failure in their collection software. We then went out and seized and obtained their 2 phones, voluntarily, I shouldn't say seized, obtained their phones from the FBI. These are now FBI devices we're talking about. And our cyber forensic team actually undertook a series of steps to seek to exploit, to extract the missing text messages from the phones. We first used our own tools to do that. That was step 1. We then went to a contractor that we use, a vendor that we use, to see whether there were additional tools. They provided us with some additional tools, so we did a second extraction and gained more text messages. We then went to the Department of Defense and asked them if they had additional tools that those first 2 steps didn't use. They said they did, and they gave us those tools, and we used that and extracted more text messages. We then went to the FBI and said, okay, here are the steps we've taken. Do we miss anything? Would you do anything differently? They said they wouldn't. We then did a quality control check, as you're supposed to do, again, following the rules, our forensic examiners, and they discovered in that last search, which occurred last month in May, that the phone had a database on it that was actually also doing a collection of text messages. They extracted those messages from the phone and found the second part of the August 8th text, no, we'll stop it. That was found in early May because of that fourth effort to extract information from the phones. It turned out that the FBI wasn't aware that that database on there, which was supposed to be an operating function, was actually collecting data.
They weren't aware of that and didn't give it to you, but had they gone through the same steps you had gone through, they might have found it. In other
Correct.
words. Does that cause you to have any lack of confidence about whether or not you have all the evidence you need, all the evidence you've requested?
Yeah, clearly, as a result of that effort, and we're going to issue a separate report about the technological efforts we undertook there, and I'll be careful on how I describe them because I'm also a lawyer, not a cyber expert. But the concern is we now believe that not only are we unsure whether we have 100% collection in the period for which there was this blackout, 4 to 6 months, but it's now clear to us that even when the software at the FBI was collecting text messages, because the August 8th period was within the collection period, we had the incoming page-to-struct text. We didn't have the response. It's now clear to us that even outside this blackout period, we're not convinced that the FBI was collecting, for obvious reasons, 100% of the text messages.
Okay, that's obviously of concern. Mr. Ray, let's jump back to you for a minute. I think we can all agree that Mr. Comey should not have made his July 6th announcement and press conference. I assume you don't disagree with me on that. But would you have made a charging recommendation at all? Or would you have left that to the Department of Justice?
Well, Senator, as I said, we accept the findings and recommendations in the report. My own view is that the policies about public disclosure, as you've alluded to, are pretty clear about what we should or shouldn't do. As far as making charging recommendations privately, I think my view...
Yeah, I'm not talking about recommendations.
Right.
I'm talking about charging decisions. Yeah.
My view is that the FBI doesn't make charging decisions.
Okay, it just isn't done. Mr. Horowitz, the report says that Mr. Comey's machinations, quote, resulted in Lynch and Yates concluding that it would be counterproductive to speak directly with the FBI director. Can you unpack that for me? Help me understand what that means. Is the idea here that Lynch and Yates were simply afraid of exercising their authority, their oversight responsibilities, because they were afraid that it would look like political interference? What's that about?
So a couple things. They were responding to the fact that Director Comey, rather than speaking to them directly, went through his chief of staff to one of their aides to them to relay his view on what he was going to do. What they told us their assessment at that point was, based on their prior dealings with Director Comey, was, first of all, if they went to him directly and said, don't do it, it would, first of all, look like strong arming, and they weren't sure whether he would comply or not with the instruction. They concluded that it would be more effective, or they would have a better chance of changing the decision if they went back the same way to him with their message, which was to their principal associate deputy AG, to his chief of staff, to him. And as we lay out here, they reported back through that means that they objected or recommended, or actually, let me clarify this, they told him that they did not believe he should do it. He's testified to us that he took that as a recommendation because they didn't call him directly, and he decided they were leaving the decision to him, and so he decided to go forward.
Before I call on Senator Klobuchar, I need a quick clarification. You said earlier in reply to Senator Corden that Comey used Gmail for work, but only for unclassified information. How can you know that if you didn't get access to that account?
I'm sorry, let me correct that. Based on the emails that we saw, which we observed by looking at the FBI's server and what ended up going back to the FBI, you're correct, Senator, I can't sit here today beyond what we looked at and say precisely what other purposes he may have used it for.
Okay, Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. I wasn't going to start with this, but since Senator Lee was finishing up, I think it's good to continue with that discussion. And that is that I was a law school classmate of Director Comey. I think Director Wray knows this. I have worked with him over the years and know he's done some good work. But reading this report this weekend, I continue to disagree with his decision in how he handled those announcements. And the more I read of your report, which I thought was very thorough, I want to thank you for that, Mr. Horowitz, the more I began to focus on what you call the ad hoc decision-making based on his personal views, even if it meant rejecting long-standing department policy. And I guess I would start with you, Mr. Wray. The way I have described my job as a prosecutor in the past to people, when I do my own town hall meetings way back, I would always say it's like the show Law and Order. The first half of the show, the police do the investigation. The second half of the show, the prosecutors make a decision. Would you agree with that summary?
I think so. I guess the way I would put it is we do an investigation. We determine whether or not we think there are sufficient facts to go forward with a case, and then we present the facts to the prosecutors, who then make the decisions and exercise prosecutorial discretion. I don't think prosecutorial discretion, by definition, is something the investigative agency exercises.
Right. So you might discuss the case with the prosecutors, but in the end, they make the decision.
Yes.
And so if you had been in that place at that moment in time as the FBI director, would you have then called up in the July decision and the October decision, would you have then called up either the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General to ask them to make a decision?
Well, I don't know that I can speculate about what I would have done at the time. What I can tell you is that I cannot imagine a situation in which I would unilaterally assume for myself, as the FBI director, a charging decision and then announce it in a news conference.
Thank you. So that leads me to where I wanted to begin, and that is that when law enforcement officers act improperly, when they make mistakes, one of the great things about a democracy is we have an inspector general and we try to get that information out, and I think our democracy depends on that. But I don't think that should be confused with attacking the integrity of thousands of investigations that the FBI manages every year, investigations that are not even part of this report in any significant way, like the Russia investigation, and attacking the integrity of 35,000 FBI agents, analysts, and other public servants. I think it's very important that we defend them. And I note in your memo you did recently to the FBI after the Nunes memo was released over the objections of the FBI, you said, Director Wray, talk is cheap, the work you do is what will endure, and you urged employees to stay laser focused even when it's not easy. Could you elaborate on that?
Senator, I am a big believer in the idea that what really matters for the FBI is the work. And when I go around from office after office, the opinions that I care about the most, the brand, if you will, that I care about the most, are the opinions of the prosecutors we work with out in the field, the law enforcement partners we work out with in the field, the judges that we interact with out in the field, the juries we interact with out in the field, the victims who are making decisions about who they trust to get their loved ones back. And I think I've visited the field offices of almost every senator up here, and I will tell you that the work that they do, recovering kids who are victims of child exploitation, taking down gang members, disrupting terrorist plots, doing public corruption investigations, I could go on and on and on and on and on. And to me, those are people who experience the FBI through the work. Those are people who get to see the professionalism, the character, the integrity of FBI people up close. And we're a 37,000 person organization. We've been around for 110 years. We do thousands of investigations every year. This is one.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Horowitz, I want to go on to your report now, and much has been made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about some things that were clearly wrong that Director Wray has said there are ongoing internal investigations about this, and decisions are going to be made, and training is going to occur. But I don't want to lose the forest for the trees here in terms of what your report found. First of all, the president, upon the release of the report, tweeted that he quote, hope the IG report is not being changed and made weaker, end quote. Can you confirm that your office followed all appropriate processes in the course of its review and that the report was not changed as a result of improper political influence?
We followed normal processes. We took comments. We made decisions on the issuing the final report. It was not made weaker or softer in any regard.
Okay. In particular, the report clearly states on page 263 that it did not find evidence that the Justice Department's decision not to pursue prosecution following the investigation was politically motivated. Is that an accurate summary?
We did not find that the prosecutor's decision not to charge was the result of political bias.
And you found that the relevant decisions were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts in the law, as well as, in part, department practices. Is that correct?
As to the prosecutor's decision about whether or not to charge, that's correct.
Mm-hmm. To be clear, did you or your staff speak to any witness who would point to an example of anyone in the investigation allowing political considerations to affect their decisions on how to obtain evidence?
As I sit here, I don't recall anybody indicating that.
Did you or your staff review any documents indicating that a particular investigative decision was made for political reasons?
Well, we had concerns about the October time period and Mr. Strzok's decision.
Okay. Did you, and you're talking here in part about well, you mentioned the Russia one, but the Comey decisions to go public, is that what you're referring to?
I'm sorry. I'm talking about in terms of, and maybe I misunderstood the question, in terms of were there any decisions we had concerns about Mr. Strzok's handling of the choice in October between Russia and the Wiener laptop?
Got it. Did you determine that, and Senator Durbin has gotten the information out there about Inspector Mueller's investigation, and that's continuing, and that he is no longer, the person involved is no longer involved in that investigation?
That's correct. That's my understanding. That's correct.
Did you determine that any investigative action was a result of political bias or other improper considerations besides what we just talked about?
Prior to July 5, the specific investigative decisions we looked at, we did not find evidence, testimony or documentary evidence that they were the subject of improper considerations, including political bias.
Did your report find that senior Justice Department leadership, including then Attorney General Lynch and Deputy Attorney General Yates, had a limited role in the investigation and instead appropriately relied on career staff rather than political appointees?
We do describe here their limited involvement prior to July 5 in the day-to-day operations of the investigation.
Senator Graham.
Could I just ask one more question, Mr.
If you do it quickly.
Did you find that the department's decision-making in this case was consistent with its approach in other circumstances in terms of investigation?
We found the prosecutors described to us their process and that, in fact, that is what they base their decisions on.
Thank you.
Senator Graham.
Would you say that this investigation was done by the book?
Hard to say what by the
Well,
book is.
who wrote this book? If it was done by the book, who wrote it?
I think there are reasons to raise questions on certain of these steps and decisions.
I think you did a good job, but the whole idea that this is normal, folks, there's nothing here normal. I don't want you to think the FBI does this day in and day out. This is not normal. Now, I think that's what you tried to find.
Yeah.
Do you believe it's pretty clear to everybody in the country by July the 5th that Donald Trump was the presumptive nominee of the Republican Party?
That's my recollection. And from the text, it's pretty
on the
clear.
18th. Yeah.
Right. And the texts, I think, reflect that as well.
Okay, I'm going to read this text message from Paige to Strzok on August the 8th, after he'd gotten the nomination. She says, Trump's not ever going to become president, right? Right? Strzok responded, no, he's not. Well, stop it. Now, I don't know how you feel about that. That's pretty unnerving. Strzok, wasn't he the lead investigator of the Clinton email investigation?
He was, in essence, the lead investigator.
Okay,
yeah.
so the head guy looking at Clinton on August the 8th says we got to stop Trump. Now, was that just idle talk? A week later, here's what they say to each other. Strzok, text message to Lisa Page. I want to believe the path you threw out for consideration in Andy's office, that there's no way he gets elected, but I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event you die before you're 40. Now, that's a week later. Who's Andy?
Our understanding, it was Andy McCabe, the deputy director.
So you got the deputy director meeting with the lead investigator of the Clinton email investigation, and Miss Page, who's involved somehow, meeting in Andy's office discussing taking out an insurance policy to make sure Donald Trump doesn't become president? Is that what you're telling us?
I'll be clear, I can't speak to whether Mr. McCabe was there or not.
Did you ask Mr. McCabe?
We did. He said he was not, he did not recall.
So one of them's lying. So I want you to reopen this investigation and come back and tell us, do you believe Strzok or do you believe McCabe? Because you just told me the deputy director of the FBI says he's not the Andy.
Oh, just to be clear, they're talking about a conversation in his office.
Yeah.
He is stating he does not recall whether he was there or not. And
Well,
neither of those individuals are putting him in the middle of their conversation.
All I'm saying is at the Andy's office where this occurred, he wasn't there. What did Strzok say he was there?
Strzok says he was there.
Well, somebody's lying. So anyway, we'll figure that out later. None of this is normal, folks. Let's look at the actual interview itself. How many people were involved in the Clinton interview on July the 2nd?
There were, I believe, 6 or 8 people present, but 2 agents conducting the interview.
So as I understand it, there were 2 agents and 2 prosecutors.
Correct.
Okay. Now, this was an email sent in February 2016 from Page to McCabe. Hey, you've surely already considered this, but in my view, our best reason to hold the line at 2 and 2, 2 agents and 2 prosecutors, is she might be our next president. How did you feel about that?
We were concerned about